So now that we've started reading the book, we're going to actually start analyzing and facilitating the reading along with the book. So this is the week 7 facilitation notes. We're going to start off with the introduction. I'm Victoria Isaacson, once again, that you saw in the pre-facilitation note video. So at the beginning of the book, it introduces some slight history to Ukraine that we also talked about in the pre-facilitation note video. Ukraine gained its independence in 1991 from the collapse of the Soviet Union. And when they were in the Soviet Union, there was some stories told about how the people with disabilities were invisible and hidden within the Soviet Union. So when you're reading this, it's very important for you to pay attention to the stories here. And while you're reading it, I want you to really embed those stories into your brain and to think about that not overnight change, but pretty fast change from being invisible and hidden in the Soviet Union to the changes that we see in modern day Ukraine. Since Ukraine is quite big, they also talked about how everyone is mostly bilingual. So everyone spoke Ukrainian and then either Russian or Polish and some other languages that are around Ukraine that influences it. So they are a very diverse people spread across a very large country. So just from that sentence alone, we should start to think, how does this affect opinions? So in the later chapter, we might see that there's going to be some conflicts of opinions. So right now is a good time to reflect about how this is going to affect that in the future. So how can this word alone lead to serious political and cultural issues? So the word we're looking at is the word that translates to disabled person, but it literally translates to invalidness. The word is invalidinist. And they talked about that alongside some other words in the book. So when you're reading the definitions from Ukrainian to English, I would like you to reflect on this question. How does it actually affect us? Because the way we think with words really molds what happens in our life. The languages we learn mold how we think. And there's a lot of cool TED Talks on that and just studies in general, because TED Talks aren't that reliable. But I want you to think of the power words have, pay attention to the living conditions in the stories that people have to tell, and also what other words are there, and are they any better than this word, and maybe that should be implemented into policies. So, when Ukraine came into power, it transitioned from a very suppressive ruler to where they stopped higher education for the disabled, which we'll talk about later. And they transitioned to a country that was providing aid, and there's a lot of logistics to this shift. So what kind of mental shift do the people that live in Ukraine have to deal with, where they're suppressed and they're fighting for this freedom, to now where it's a little more sneakily hidden, where they're not as suppressed and they have all these more freedoms and supports, but they're still having issues where they need help? Can play a lot of tricks on the mind. So for the rest of the introduction, now that you've gotten a gist of it, when you're reading it, focus on how people try to take back the power into their own hands, and critically think about how the oppression from the Soviet Union spurs this more independence and rule idea, and the repercussions this could have in the future. So if they're taking back more power from the state governments and the national government, and they're trying to put it back into people's hands, how is that going to affect aid and ruling bodies in the future? Very important point to keep in mind. So for chapter 1, we see a parallel world. So we see the implications of words like breaking, and we see Sasha's story of when he experienced this breaking. So when we're reading things like this, we need to really analyze, once again, word usage and how this, it's a little bit of food for thought, how this molds how Sasha thinks. So he and his whole family applies this to him breaking. And you see a lot more stories of accidents which show a very strong connection to revitalizations of religion and also the same word of breaking. So do these people actually see themselves as breaking and no longer being themselves? It's a very important demoralizing word. Think about the implications this could have. Hospital conditions, they pay attention to the separation factors between the West and what they're panning up to be in Ukraine. There's more exploratory surgery. There's less window, like the window between when surgeries are supposed to be done. A lot of surgeries are being done outside of that, and there's more scalpel use. And then there's a lack of staff and supplies and care, leading to more complications, which is a big problem, especially in surgeries involving spines, which is very minute and small. In addition to stuff like the hospitals not having enough information, or they're just not getting to the patients in time for the surgery. When they're using scalpels, they're not using the microtechnology that other countries have, and they're not worried about malpractice, but it could leave the patients in worse condition than they could be from other countries. So there's a lot of implications that can come from that. There's also family impacts of injuries. Ask yourself I want you to read this and ask yourself how you think the finances would impact your family and put it in your shoes. Sasha's family couldn't really afford it as you read it because they had aid, but healthcare collapsed while he was in this situation. So there's a lot of different rotating factors that can happen with a disability like this that lasts for your whole life. Governments might not be stable the whole time. The new fit Soviet man is just an ideology to keep in mind throughout this whole chapter. So you have disabilities challenging this and increasing and an increased stigma. So now that Ukraine is independent from the Soviet Union, there's this new stigma that they have to be the strong power, that there's no invalids within this country. But there are. And whenever people see them, there's an immediate gut reaction that even Sasha admits to having, where he's like, oh, I wish we could just round these people up and put them somewhere else. And then he stops himself and realizes, I'm one of those people. So it's a thought process deeply embedded, just not in, it's in everyone. And it even was embedded into himself. And then we go back to in the chapter again, you go back into the lack of medical equipment and rehabilitation, which impacts mobility in life for the rest of their life with just rehab. Like, you can't get better and you can't get more mobile. You get more bed sores, you can get sick again. And a lot of people ended up doing sports to get the exercise they needed to become more mobile, and that was an outlet for that. Then you have the workforce, where they pay attention and note the key difference, and he had to go to work and then prove his position just to lose it. So look at the struggles he had to go through compared to someone that could just apply to the job. And then at the end, they talk about how Sasha started the company Lotus with his mother, I believe it was, and the impact it has on the community. And he makes a comment that's basically along the same lines as it's only up from here. You got to work from the bottom up. And their organization is working with disabled children to build skills and consultations. So Sasha's story paints this grim image, one that shows a need for reform. And I think every country needs reform. So it's important to not be super critical of just this one country, but also keep in mind that a lot of countries, even when they look good on paper, might also have, when you hear the stories, might also have the same grim image. Questions to keep in mind during this chapter, and then to answer at the end of it, is: do you think giving young disabled children work skills will give them better opportunities to secure a job in the future? So will the program through Lotus help impact these children's future? It's a good question to ask. Or will the social barrier be too high? Now we move on to chapter 2, or section 2 of the book. And the first book, and this part of the book discusses the history behind the disabilities in just this area of Ukraine under Soviet rule and afterwards. So in pre-Soviet era, so before the Soviets came to power after the Bolshevik Revolution, there's little to no information about the disabilities and the mental illness in the country because there's a lot of romanticized scripts. There's very poor documentation in general. But there are some stories of solicitation and beggars around churches. And this is expected to be like some mentally ill people, possible people that are missing legs, etc., stuff like that. But once again, we don't have a lot of scripture for this period. When Peter the Great was in charge from 1682 to 1725, he identifies the fools and puts in place regulations. So it exempts them from service, but also limits their rights. They're not allowed to get married, and it also decreases the amount of land they can own. Then when you have Catherine II come in, it's the era of the madhouses, where you have all these basically insane asylums pop up, where people that might not even be insane, where they might even just have anxiety, are being put in these houses, and they're viewed in this very dread and gloomy outlook. So a lot of people were still being cared by their family. And then in 1807, you see the first school for the deaf, shortly followed by the first school for the blind. And then over time after that, the trend continues with an increase in institutions in the 19th and 20th century. Prizehof wrote a book, and this book ended up starring courses that led him to being kicked out of the country. He wrote on 2 categories, which he called the hysterics and then the holy fools and prophets. And his writings indicated that the people were deceiving everyone. So he wrote about the holy fools, very specifically being like, oh, they're just deceiving everyone, they're just here to get your money and then donate to other people. And it put the mentally ill in a very negative light more so, and it was just plain false. It made it seem like they had the choice to be like this. So then the book moves on to the earliest Soviet period, and there is more talk about the invalid and how they're unable to work. So in this chapter, I think it's very, very important for you to think about the overall person, just able-bodied in general, role in the early Soviet period life. And if you think about this, you will see that the person in this basically communist society's role is to work. And if you can't work, you're not any use to the government. So a lot of the rules that you're going to see laid out here and that you'll cover, and I want you to really think about, goes back to the onset of you're not useful to the government if you cannot work. So what you see is a legal directive to categorize these people to see who they can still make use of. So they reorganize homes and put people in these homes not based on their disabilities, but based on their work capabilities, which is a key point because if you cared about the actual people, you put them in based on how they live. And they cared about the heavy workforce, not so much the people. They wanted to have a lot of people to make a lot of objects for the post-war period. And just think about the reasons behind their treatment and thoughts of the veterans who were injured. I think this is a very key point. Most countries after war revere their veterans and treat them in high respect and don't expect them to work. The Soviets thought it was a shame that some of these people had lived. And I want you to read more about that and come up with your own opinions on it. And then I'd like you to consider what the reasons behind their different treatment of their veterans was. There's also pensions and institutions were created in this time. I would like you to think about why. And think about why it goes back to that point of they needed the workforce. And then the responsibility kept shifting onto the local government. The national government didn't want anything to do with the invalids, as they called them. And then there was also the fetishment of the hardened, scarred man in Soviet times. So there's this stigma behind they wanted this strong man, and if he wasn't able to deal with his scars, then he wasn't like a Soviet man. So there's also just this fetishized image of what a Soviet man was that also causes problems when you're looking at policies and implications of laws and just the stigma behind it. So think about that too. For the rest of the chapter, we look kind of at an overall division where they talk about different subsets like education and work and different divisional forces. So for the most part, I just want you to read this chapter and just pay attention to the way they're treating these people, how they're kind of just getting them out of the way, and overall. But these are some key points to pay attention to. Pay attention to how they categorize people and how they deem them less valuable, and when they're deemed less valuable, they're given less. And the people at the very bottom of this pyramid are disabled children that are born disabled. So they don't even care that they're just children and they didn't get into accidents or they're veterans or anything like this. They give them basically nothing at this point. So think about the precursors that would hint to you at this. The Soviets are very efficient at cutting off protests and congregation points for the unrest from this categorization and everything like that. You see that in modern day Russia now. They're very effective at cutting off protests. And then large influx of people into homes. They're called Dorma Internati, which were very good at working and then just getting people in one place at one time. And then those were also created around the same time that there was a political movement of wanting to remove blemishes from the community. And they wanted to just make the Soviet Union look better. So it's kind of a way of hiding their people, making them look less visible to the public. And then I want you to clinically think about the education school centers they set up and why they would set it up the way they did. Why do they set up the programs? Why do they not care about how the schools are set up? Is there a reason they're setting a cap on the education for just the disabled students? slave labor. Basically, the people that could work were doing very menial tasks like making nets, and they were doing it for basically nothing, just for their communities. So think about how this was exploited and how they exploited these people through their words, through their policies. And then athletic groups were ultimately the one group that got through protesting-wise. The athletic groups were gathering, and they brought attention to the unrest in the groups who needed it because they did physical displays of what they could do. They showed up and were like, we can do this, and people are telling you otherwise. And throughout the rest of the piece, pay attention to the studies and how they change what come. So after Ukraine is settled and the Soviet Union is gone, how do things change, and were they for the better? How does disability studies affect the outcome of everything? And ultimately, the final question and answer at the end of this is, were these changes enough? And I want you to analyze the effects of these words, the effects of the words and the social changes that occurred alongside the policies. And what I mean by words is the change of the definition of disabled. Does it matter?